At Camp Forrest, Tennessee, January 20th, 1944, Colonel Harry Reeder stood before 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men who would become the strangest unit in United States Army history. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had just been activated, and nobody knew exactly how to train them because nothing like this had ever existed before. No manuals, no instruction protocols, no precedent for what the Army was asking them to do, which was to impersonate entire divisions using nothing but rubber, creativity, and nerve. The mathematics of their mission were brutal and simple. 1,100 men would need to convince German intelligence that they were facing 30,000 American soldiers with hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, and they would have to do this while operating within a quarter-mile of enemy lines, armed with nothing heavier than .50 caliber machine guns. The men selected for this assignment came from art schools in New York and Philadelphia, from advertising agencies and architecture firms, recruited not for their ability to fight, but for their capacity to deceive. Among them were future fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane, artists who would spend the next year and a half painting fake armies across the battlefields of Europe. The War Department had given Colonel Reeder 1 officer and 57 enlisted men on activation day, and by the time the unit reached France 5 months later, that number had grown to include 4 complete battalions absorbed into a single deception apparatus that would operate in absolute secrecy. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion brought 379 men skilled in visual deception. The 244th Signal Operations Company contributed radio and communications specialists. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special provided sonic. Deception experts trained by Bell Laboratories engineers and Company A of the 406th Engineer Combat Battalion supplied combat engineers and perimeter security. These units had been training separately across different installations, developing technologies and techniques that had never been tested in actual combat, and now they were being merged into a single experimental force tasked with deceiving the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world. The training at Camp Forrest proceeded without roadmaps because there was no institutional knowledge to draw from. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson developed most of the standard operating procedures from scratch, creating doctrine for a type of warfare that existed only in theory. The men learned to inflate rubber tanks using gasoline-powered air compressors in 20 minutes flat, practiced mixing sound effect recordings on wire recorders that could hold 30 minutes of audio on spools containing 2 miles of magnetized stainless steel wire, and rehearsed radio deception techniques that required them to mimic the unique Morse code patterns of actual signal operators down to individual quirks and timing variations. They studied aerial reconnaissance photography to understand what German pilots would see from 3,000 feet, learned to create convincing tank tracks using bulldozers dragging steel plates, and practiced the theatrical skills needed to impersonate officers from divisions they had never served in. By April 10, 1944, Colonel Reeder and 6 senior officers departed by plane for England to begin reconnaissance and coordination with British deception units who had pioneered similar techniques during Operation Bertram at El Alamein in 1942. The main body of troops sailed on May 2nd aboard the Liberty ship Henry Gibbons, crossing the Atlantic in 13 days and landing at Bristol on May 15th without incident, despite German bomber raids on the port the night before debarkation. They established camps near Stratford-upon-Avon and participated in Operation Fortitude, the massive pre-invasion deception that convinced German High Command the Allied landings would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Sonic Unit, still undergoing specialized training at Pine Camp in upstate New York with Bell Labs engineers, would join them later in France after D-Day. The inflatable M4 Sherman tank weighed 93 pounds fully inflated and measured 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches to the top of the turret. A real M4 Sherman tank weighed 32 tons. Officers who had commanded actual armored battalions found themselves frustrated and disoriented by this reversal, struggling with the adjustment from commanding instruments of destruction to managing theatrical props that 4 men could lift and carry. The tanks were designed by Fred Patton at the United States Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, the same engineer who had designed inflatable one-man life rafts for fighter pilots in the Pacific, and manufactured by a consortium that included U.S. Rubber, Goodyear, and the Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company in Pennsylvania. 16-year-old Teresa Ricard worked the 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock shift after school at the Alice Mill in Woonsocket, earning 49 cents an hour, cementing inflatable tubes and folding them into shapes that would become what the workers called targets. The skeleton of each tank consisted of inflatable rubber tubes covered with a neoprene skin, with the turret inflated separately and then attached to the body, and the entire assembly could be deflated, folded into a bundle the size of a duffel bag, and carried by 2 soldiers. The Ghost Army deployed with hundreds of these inflatable decoys, along with rubber jeeps, trucks, artillery pieces, and even aircraft, all painted with authentic details and weathering that would pass inspection from German reconnaissance planes flying at altitude. The cardinal rule when working with inflatables was never to carry one across a road or any open area where it might be observed, because a single German spotter watching 4 soldiers casually hoisting a 40-ton tank would instantly compromise weeks of careful deception. Corporal Arthur Shilstone learned this lesson when 2 French civilians on bicycles blundered past his guard post and saw Ghost Army soldiers repositioning a Sherman, their faces registering bewilderment until Shilstone told them, in broken French, that the Americans were very strong. The visual deception required obsessive attention to environmental detail that went far beyond simply placing inflatable equipment in fields. Bulldozers equipped with steel plates dragged behind them carved convincing tank tracks in mud and dirt, tracks that had to show the correct width, depth, and turning, radius that actual Sherman tanks would create. Real artillery shells were scattered around fake guns to create the debris and clutter of an active artillery position. Dummy command posts appeared with appropriate radio antennas, guy wires, and the worn paths that soldiers' boots would create around high-traffic areas. Laundry lines were strung with actual uniforms to suggest billeting areas, and garbage pits were dug and partially filled to indicate how long a unit had occupied a position. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual deception specialists, understood that German intelligence analyzed reconnaissance photographs for these exact details, cross-referencing aerial images with ground reports and radio intercepts to build comprehensive pictures of Allied dispositions. A single inconsistency, a tank without tracks, or an artillery battery without ammunition storage, could unravel an entire operation. The men worked primarily at night to avoid Allied air patrols that might inadvertently photograph their activities, inflating equipment after dark and camouflaging it imperfectly by dawn so that German reconnaissance flights at first light would spot exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to see. The speed of deployment was critical because tactical situations changed rapidly, and the unit developed procedures that allowed them to create an entire armored division's worth of equipment, complete with appropriate spacing and defensive positions, in less than 6 hours. The sonic deception component introduced an entirely new dimension of battlefield illusion that had never been attempted at this scale. Working with engineers from Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey, the 3,132nd Signal Service Company had traveled to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to record authentic sounds of armored and infantry units onto wire recorders using cutting-edge equipment that represented the most advanced audio technology of 1944. They captured the sounds of Sherman tanks starting, idling, and maneuvering across different terrain types, the distinctive rumble of M7 Priest self-propelled guns, the metallic clanking of bridge construction, the organized chaos of convoy movements, and even the ambient sounds of troop bivouacs, including sergeants shouting orders and the murmur of mess lines. These recordings were then mixed in the field, combined on multiple tracks, to create layered soundscapes that matched whatever scenario the deception required. The playback system consisted of powerful amplifiers and speakers mounted on M3 half-track vehicles, armored personnel carriers with wheels in front and tracks in the rear that provided mobility and protection. Each speaker weighed 500 pounds and was housed in weatherproof enclosures designed by Jensen, and the entire system could project sound that remained audible 15 miles away under favorable atmospheric conditions. The sonic teams operated mobile weather stations because wind speed, direction, humidity, and temperature all affected sound propagation, and they had to calculate precise speaker positioning and volume levels to ensure German sound-ranging equipment would detect what appeared to be genuine military activity at the expected distances. Lieutenant Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, the flamboyant public relations man who had orchestrated Amelia Earhart's first solo transatlantic flight in 1932, commanded the sonic program with absolute commitment to technical perfection and theatrical effect. If you want to see how the Ghost Army pulled off their greatest deception at the Rhine River and fooled an entire German army, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because it helps us share these forgotten stories of courage that changed history. Back to the video. The Ghost Army's first full-scale combat operation, designated Operation Elephant, launched between July 1st and 4th, 1944, in Normandy, with only 44 officers and 351 enlisted men participating, representing just 37% of the unit's strength. The mission required them to cover the movement of the 2nd Armored Division, as it left reserve positions to enter the line between the 1st and 3rd Armies, creating the illusion that the division remained in place while it actually deployed elsewhere. The operation achieved mixed results and exposed critical gaps in the unit's procedures, but it provided invaluable combat experience that would inform every subsequent deception. The techniques improved rapidly, but employment of the unit remained problematic as Army commanders struggled to understand how to integrate deception operations into conventional tactical planning. Operation Brest, conducted between August 20th and 27th, 1944, sent half the Ghost Army to the Great Port City on the Brittany Peninsula, with orders to augment the perceived strength of American forces surrounding the German-held fortress. The 8th Corps, consisting of the 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions, had been assigned to take Brest after the 6th Armored Division sliced through the peninsula and then withdrew, and the Ghost Army was tasked with impersonating that departed armored division to convince German General Hermann Bernhard Ramke that his position was hopeless. The deception included a complete array of visual, sonic, and radio elements, with inflatable tanks positioned on the flanks to draw anti-tank attention away from the center where a real attack might develop. German resistance remained fierce despite the deception, and Brest held out for weeks, but the operation gave the 23rd critical experience coordinating all 3 deception elements simultaneously under combat conditions within range of enemy artillery. Operation Bettembourg, mounted between September 15th and 22nd, 1944, demonstrated the Ghost Army's value in crisis situations where tactical deception could prevent disaster. General George Patton's 3rd Army was attacking the fortress city of Metz, with most of his divisions committed to the assault, leaving a dangerous gap of more than 25 miles between Metz and Luxembourg City, held only by a squadron of the 3rd Armored Cavalry under Colonel James Polk. Patton wrote to his wife about this vulnerability, noting there was one rather bad spot in his line, but he didn't think the Germans knew it, adding that he was hiding it by the grace of God and a lot of guts. The Ghost Army deployed on September 14th after receiving orders that morning, with half the unit pulling out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to drive more than 200 miles to the front. They impersonated the 6th Armored Division along the Moselle River, creating the appearance of a fully equipped armored division defending what was actually a perilously thin line. For 7 days, until real reinforcements arrived, the illusion held. Inflatable tanks appeared in fields, sonic trucks played recordings of tank movements and maintenance activities throughout the nights, and radio operators transmitted the complex communications patterns of an armored division headquarters. German forces probed the sector, but never launched the major attack that would have exposed the deception and potentially cut Patton's army in two. The success at Bettembourg earned the Ghost Army credibility with field commanders who began to understand the tactical possibilities of deception warfare. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces launched their massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the Ghost Army conducted Operation Kodak, a radio-only deception that helped draw German attention away from Patton's relief effort to save the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. This operation required no inflatable equipment, no sonic trucks, just skilled radio operators mimicking the communications patterns of divisions that were actually moving in different directions, creating phantom formations that German intelligence had to account for in their planning. The radio deception specialists of the 244th Signal Company had perfected the art of impersonating specific signal operators, learning to replicate not just call signs and frequencies, but the individual sending styles of Morse code operators, the timing between characters, the pressure patterns, even the minor errors and corrections that gave each operator a distinctive signature. German signals intelligence monitored Allied radio traffic constantly, building detailed order-of-battle pictures from the patterns they detected, and the Ghost Army exploited this surveillance by feeding carefully crafted misinformation into the system. The operators studied actual signal logs from the units they were impersonating, memorized standard message formats and encryption procedures, and transmitted during the hours when those units would normally be most active. Some deceptions required maintaining the radio presence of a division while it actually moved to a new sector, creating the impression that the unit remained in position for days after it had already departed. Other operations involved fabricating entirely fictional units, complete with appropriate radio nets, that would tie down German intelligence analysts trying to locate formations that did not exist. On March 18, 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops began deploying for Operation Viersen, the largest and most complex deception they would ever attempt. The objective, as stated in the official Army report, was to deceive the enemy as to the actual Rhine River crossing area, the strength of the crossing, and the time of the crossing. After weeks of hard fighting, the 9th and 1st Armies had finally broken across the Roer River to the Rhine in late February, and while the 1st Army had seized the bridge at Remagen through an audacious dash, the 9th Army remained held on the river line, preparing for a massive assault crossing. The 9th Army had 3 corps arrayed from north to south: 16th Corps, 13th Corps, and 19th Corps, with the latter 2 heavily weighted with 3 infantry divisions and 1 armored division each. The 13th Corps held the 30th, 84th, and 102nd Infantry Divisions plus the 5th Armored Division, while the 19th Corps controlled the 29th, 79th, and 83rd Infantry Divisions plus the 2nd Armored Division. However, the 16th Corps zone presented the most advantageous terrain for a river crossing, so Army planners selected that sector for the main assault scheduled for March 23rd. 2 elite infantry divisions, the 30th and 79th, were transferred from the 13th and 19th Corps to reinforce 16th Corps, which already held the 35th Infantry Division, 75th Infantry Division, and 8th Armored Division. The challenge facing 9th Army was how to conceal this massive redeployment and prevent German forces from concentrating against the actual crossing site. The deception plan, conceived by Lieutenant Colonel Merrick Truly, the 23rd's liaison officer attached to 9th Army headquarters, called for the Ghost Army to simulate the continued presence of the 30th and 79th Divisions in the 13th Corps sector, while the actual divisions assembled 10 miles north in the 16th Corps zone. This operation represented the culmination of everything the unit had learned over 20 previous deceptions, and it involved not just the Ghost Army, but coordination with genuine 9th Army assets across the entire front. The scale of the deception was staggering. 600 inflatable dummies representing 2 complete divisions and 40,000 troops, sonic trucks playing recordings of bridge construction and artillery fire throughout the nights, radio networks simulating division-level communications, and elaborate cover activities by real units to enhance the illusion. Corps and division artillery units increased fire in the deception sector and spread out their installations with rubber dummy guns provided by the 23rd. Corps engineers established new equipment parks and conducted conspicuous parades with bridging equipment to suggest imminent crossing operations. Tank destroyer emplacements were constructed along the front in numbers and patterns similar to those being built in 16th Corps. Anti-aircraft defenses were augmented with 64 40mm guns and 16 90mm guns, all inflatable, and on some nights the anti-aircraft batteries sent up fierce demonstrations of firepower that rivaled their activity on the Normandy beaches. Infantry patrols intensified their activity to levels 50% greater than 16th Corps to suggest increased preparation for offensive action. The Ghost Army soldiers executed their roles with precision developed through a year of operations. They erected fake division headquarters with appropriate antennas and communications traffic, stenciled fabricated division numbers and insignias onto their vehicles, and sewed counterfeit shoulder patches onto their uniforms. Officers impersonating commanders from the 30th and 79th Divisions made appearances in local towns, visiting cafes and bars where they discussed their unit's supposed plans loudly enough to be overheard by potential German intelligence agents or sympathetic civilians who might report what they heard. The sonic trucks broadcast carefully mixed soundtracks that included the sounds of pontoon bridge construction, the rumble of assembling armor, artillery fire preparation, and even officers swearing at subordinates to put out cigarettes, small, authentic details that gave the deception texture and credibility. The operation ran from March 18th through March 24th, maintaining constant pressure on German intelligence to track and respond to what appeared to be major offensive preparations in the 13th Corps sector. The actual crossing by 16th Corps on March 23rd achieved complete tactical surprise, with German forces deployed to meet threats that existed only in rubber and radio waves. The 30th Division's intelligence officer reported that the American attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. The 79th Division captured a German order of battle map just prior to the attack that showed the division positioned approximately where the Ghost Army had portrayed it, and German intelligence had lost track of the 30th Division altogether. 9th Army intelligence assessed that the Germans expected the main Allied effort to be made north of Wesel with a minor crossing opposite Krefeld, exactly where the Ghost Army had staged its phantom armies. The technical challenges of maintaining deception operations over days and weeks in combat conditions tested the Ghost Army's ingenuity and adaptability constantly. Inflatable equipment punctured by shell fragments had to be repaired in the field using patch kits and adhesive, with crews working through the night to restore damaged decoys before dawn reconnaissance flights. Weather created persistent problems. High winds could topple or deflate equipment. Rain made mud that complicated track creation and vehicle positioning. and fog limited German aerial reconnaissance, but also reduced the effectiveness of visual deception. The air compressors required to inflate equipment ran on gasoline, creating noise and exhaust that had to be managed carefully to avoid compromising operations. And when compressors failed or fuel ran short, crews resorted to bicycle pumps or even inflating equipment by lung power, an exhausting process that could take hours. The sonic equipment proved temperamental. In field conditions, with the wire recorders vulnerable to damage from rough handling during transport, moisture affecting the magnetic wire and causing audio distortion, and the speakers requiring constant maintenance to prevent failures during operations. Cold weather in the winter of 1944 and 1945 created additional complications as hydraulic fluids thickened, batteries lost capacity, and the neoprene skins of inflatable equipment became brittle and prone to cracking. Supply lines for specialized equipment stretched across hundreds of miles from rear depots, and when inflatable replacements or sonic components were unavailable, the Ghost Army had to improvise using local materials and creative modifications. The human factor in deception operations involved calculated risks that placed Ghost Army soldiers in extreme danger. Operating within a quarter-mile of enemy lines, often closer, meant constant exposure to artillery fire, small arms fire, and the possibility of being overrun during German counterattacks or probing actions. The 406th Engineer Combat Company provided perimeter security with infantry weapons and tactics, but the visual and sonic specialists were trained primarily in their technical roles, not infantry combat, and their defensive capabilities were limited. During operations, Ghost Army soldiers had to continue working under fire, maintaining the deception even when German artillery began ranging on their positions, because abandoning the illusion prematurely could endanger the real units they were protecting. Some operations required personnel to remain in exposed positions for days, living in foxholes near their inflatable equipment, eating cold rations, and sleeping in shifts while maintaining the appearance of an active military installation. The psychological pressure of this type of warfare was unique. Failure in conventional combat might cost a battle, but failure in deception could expose entire divisions to unexpected attack and kill thousands. The men carried this responsibility through 21 major operations and numerous smaller deceptions across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, operating from shortly after D-Day until the German surrender in May 1945. The success rate of Ghost Army operations varied considerably, and not all deceptions achieved their intended effects. Some operations failed because German intelligence had already determined actual Allied dispositions through other means, rendering the deception irrelevant. Others were compromised by Allied troops who inadvertently revealed information, or by German patrols that penetrated close enough to detect the inflatable equipment. Weather sometimes prevented German reconnaissance flights during critical periods, leaving no enemy observers to deceive. Radio deceptions could be neutralized if German signals intelligence had already tracked the actual units through previous transmissions or physical sighting reports. The Army's official history of the 23rd, written immediately after the war by Captain Fred Fox, who served with the unit, acknowledged these limitations honestly while documenting the operations that clearly succeeded in drawing German forces away from actual Allied movements. Post-war interrogation of German officers and examination of captured intelligence documents confirmed that the Ghost Army had successfully deceived enemy commanders on multiple occasions, but quantifying exactly how many lives were saved remained impossible. Conservative estimates suggested the unit's deceptions preserved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives by preventing German forces from concentrating against weak points or real attacks. But the true number would never be known, because successful deception by definition prevents battles that otherwise might have occurred. General George Patton became one of the Ghost Army's strongest advocates after experiencing firsthand how deception operations could solve tactical problems that conventional forces could not address. When dangerous gaps opened in his lines during offensive operations, when he needed to disguise troop movements or mask weak sectors, he called for the 23rd, and he actively participated in making the deceptions more effective by suggesting improvements and ensuring his actual units coordinated with the Ghost Army's activities. Other commanders remained skeptical or failed to understand how to employ deception properly, using the unit in operations where the tactical situation did not support successful illusion or where the deception requirements exceeded what 1,100 men could realistically achieve. The learning curve for conventional officers in understanding deception warfare was steep, and the Ghost Army spent considerable effort educating higher headquarters on what deception could and could not accomplish. The most successful operations occurred when Ghost Army liaison officers like Lieutenant Colonel Truly were embedded in Army or Corps planning staffs early enough to shape operations around deception capabilities, allowing the conventional and deception elements to work in genuine coordination rather than having deception tasks assigned as afterthoughts to tactical plans already in motion. The operational tempo of the Ghost Army exceeded that of most combat units, because deception operations often required rapid deployment, intense work periods of several days, and immediate redeployment to new sectors for subsequent missions. The unit moved frequently, sometimes displacing hundreds of miles between operations, and the men seldom enjoyed the rest periods that frontline combat units received when rotating to rear areas. The technical specialists worked brutally long hours during operations, inflating equipment through the night, conducting sonic operations during darkness hours when sound carried. Farthest and German listening posts were most active, and maintaining radio deceptions around the clock to sustain the illusion. The stress of this operational pace, combined with the constant danger and the weight of responsibility they carried, created casualty rates from exhaustion, illness, and stress-related conditions that rivaled some infantry units. Yet the men maintained remarkable morale throughout, sustained by the knowledge that their creative skills were saving lives and the pride of belonging to a unit unlike any other in military history. The artists among them documented their experiences through sketches and paintings created during brief periods between operations, producing an extraordinary visual record of the war that captured both the conventional combat they observed and the surreal nature of their deception work. On July 15, 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops returned to the United States after 14 months of operations in Europe. The original plan called for the unit to redeploy to the Pacific Theater to conduct deception operations supporting the planned invasion of Japan, but the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August ended the war before any Pacific deployment occurred. The unit was deactivated, and every member was sworn to strict secrecy about their wartime service. All records were classified at the highest levels, equipment was packed away or destroyed, and the official history written by Captain Fox remained locked in classified archives. The men returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they could not share with families, friends, or even fellow veterans. At reunions and veterans gatherings, Ghost Army soldiers listened to other men tell war stories, while remaining silent about their own experiences bound by secrecy oaths that carried criminal penalties for violation. Some men carried this burden for decades without complaint, while others struggled with the isolation of possessing knowledge they could not discuss. The families of Ghost Army veterans often knew only that their fathers or husbands had served somewhere in Europe doing something involving camouflage or signals, with no understanding of the actual nature or significance of their service. The Pentagon denied the Ghost Army's existence for more than 50 years, deflecting inquiries and maintaining classification of all related documents through multiple wars and successive generations of military leadership. The reasons for this extended secrecy remain partially unclear, but likely involved protecting deception techniques and technologies that might still prove useful in future conflicts, and avoiding disclosure of collaboration between military intelligence and civilian scientists and engineers that might complicate future partnerships. In 1996, more than 5 decades after the war's end, the Army finally declassified the Ghost Army records, releasing thousands of pages of operational reports, after-action summaries, technical specifications, and Captain Fox's complete official history. The declassification allowed the story to emerge into public knowledge, though by that time, many Ghost Army veterans had already died without ever receiving public recognition for their service. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker and author, began researching the unit's history and produced a documentary titled The Ghost Army in 2013, followed by a book co-authored with Elizabeth Sales. These works brought the story to wider audiences and began the process of securing formal recognition for the veterans. On February 1, 2022, President Joe Biden signed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3001 133rd Signal Service Company Special, which had operated independently in Italy using similar deception techniques. 3 Ghost Army veterans, Seymour Nussenbaum, John Christman, and Bernard Bluestein, attended the ceremony on Capitol Hill, representing all the men who had served in the unit and accepting recognition that came decades after their wartime service. The honor acknowledged not just the tactical effectiveness of their deceptions, but the unique courage required to wage war through illusion rather than firepower, to operate in mortal danger while armed primarily with imagination and technical skill, and to maintain absolute secrecy about their accomplishments for more than half a century. No active Army unit traces direct lineage from the 23rd, but both psychological operations and information operations communities use the Ghost Army patch as an informal symbol, recognizing the unit as pioneers in influence operations and battlefield deception that remain relevant to modern warfare. On November 3, 2022, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were made honorary members of the United States Army Psychological Operations Regiment, formally connecting the Ghost Army's legacy to contemporary military doctrine. The inflatable tanks and sonic trucks are gone now, scattered across museums or lost to time, but the principles they demonstrated endure. The Ghost Army proved that deception, properly executed with attention to detail and coordination with conventional operations, could achieve tactical effects equivalent to deploying actual divisions, and could do so at a fraction of the cost in lives and resources. The 1,100 men who served in the 23rd demonstrated that warfare requires not just physical courage, but intellectual creativity, that artists and engineers could be as valuable on battlefields as infantry and armor, and that the most effective weapons are sometimes the ones that never fire a shot. Their legacy lives in the understanding that victory comes not only through superior force, but through superior thinking, through the ability to make enemies see what you want them to see, and believe what you need them to believe. The Ghost Army fought their war with rubber and radio waves, with sound effects and painted canvas, and in doing so they saved thousands of lives while proving that in war, as in art, the most powerful realities are sometimes the ones we create. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because every click ensures that this piece of history is worth remembering. You making it this far means something. Why not give the video a thumbs up? We would love and appreciate that. See you in the next one.